Hello, Shelby County Public Schools. This is Jamie Mazine here, your response to intervention consultant. I'm also here with Nancy Page, your response to intervention coordinator. And today we've decided to do a video for your yearly MTSS overview. We chose to do this year for a number of reasons, one of which is because of the pandemic, and we wanted to make sure that we're minimizing your contact as much as possible so we don't have to get a big group of people together and go through this like we have been in the past. But also, we think it's probably a whole lot better for efficiency of time for you and for us. We're going to try and do this as a video today around the overview of MTSS for the year. So the goal of this video is just to, for those of you who's experienced MTSS in Shelby County for the last few years, it's here just to refresh you over the important components of MTSS, why we do what we do, and a little bit about how we do what we do. Our responsibility as your consultants and your coordinator for MTSS is about three prongs. The first one is we work with administrators. So your RTI contact for your school, we work with them to determine how is your MTSS system going to work, what are some of the important pieces that they're able to kind of keep going and leverage, and what does the system look like. Another prong is to meet with teachers and analyze data, look at student work samples, and help build plans for students. And then our third support system that is really that we really want to spend more time this year being able to access is the work that we do with interventionists. Previously, a lot of our work have been around with administrators and regular classroom teachers to develop the system and develop Tier 2 supports. But this year, we've made a few revisions to how we're going to be meeting with teachers and teams, so that way we can have a little bit more time to meet with interventionists. I kind of feel like maybe we've neglected the interventionists, and so we've got to really make sure that we're supporting them this year. So one of the small changes that we're going to make this year is moving from Nancy and I meeting with every teacher one-on-one to us doing PLCs within our grade level teams to talk about kiddos and building plans and thinking about who on our team can have the best impact in different areas. So we'll be able to leverage each other. It's going to be more collaborative. So we think beyond just it being more efficient for everyone, we think it's going to be a better support for you also. You guys have amazing knowledge on how to intervene for students. You've been through this process for quite some time. Those of you who haven't been through this process, it's going to be great for you because you're going to be able to leverage your teammates. And we can all grow in this together and really make sure that we're owning all of this growth for kids together. So let's just talk a little bit about what is MTSS, what does it stand for, and why do we do it? So MTSS is an umbrella term that talks about how we support students academically, socially, behaviorally, adaptively, emotionally. We used to call this system RTI, but really response to intervention around the country refers to just the academic aspect of intervention. Shelby County, we really leverage other supports to make sure kids are growing. So we also look at behavior. We also look at their adaptive skills. We think about what kind of systems and structures do we have in our school already that we can leverage to support students even more effectively than we have in the past. So we're thinking about PBIS structures, both our core system and our Tier 2 supports for PBIS. We're thinking about how do we leverage our counselor, how do we leverage the mental health consultants, how do we leverage our Friskies, how are we leveraging outside supports to really kind of pull together to make sure that we're meeting all of the needs for as many kids that need those supports. That's why it's called multi-tiered system of supports. So really it's a system that is in your school. It's a school-based system that Nancy and I support by helping to make sure that you have the different components of MTSS system. So it's smooth, you understand the process, your administrators understand the process, the interventionists understand the process, and even our parents understand the process. And so when you have a system and it runs smoothly, everybody understands the procedures and the protocols. So it doesn't matter what school you're in, what grade level you're in, the system itself is the same across the district. So really it's a framework to help us make sure that we're analyzing universal screening data so we can prevent instead of just being reactionary. And so we analyze MAP data at the beginning of the year, just as one data point, just as one piece of information to help us start selecting students that need to be in intervention programs. We also use something called the Student Risk Screening Scale, internal and externalizing behaviors. It's a little screener that you're going to get where we're screening for behavioral concerns. So that's another way that we kind of figure out which kids preemptively need to be in some type of supports before they get to a point where there's some really big struggles. So we use universal data, both academic and behavior, to help us select students that this is going to be most impactful for. The purpose of MTSS really is to intervene early so that students can catch up with their peers and not experience big gaps in their academic achievement and behavioral development. This is Mike Matos, and he is an author of several books around RTI and MTSS. He's also been a principal along with his partner, who you're also going to see on this video, Chris Weber. Chris Weber, I think, is actually still a principal and doing this work along with doing professional development, writing articles, and helping us understand more about response to intervention and how to get a system up and going in schools. If you have been around in the district for a while, you've heard a lot about competency-based education, and so Mike Matos has really played a big part in how that is developed, because one of the components of competency-based education is around intervention. If we don't have intervention, if we're not meeting the needs of students that are struggling, then there is no competency-based education. We have to be intervening for students. We have to enter into their learning of where they are. So anyway, let's sit back and listen just a few minutes to what Mike has to say. He's a really wise guy, and we try and base everything that we do off of Mike Matos and Chris Weber. Let's see what he's got to say.
Response to intervention could be simply described as building a system of supports for kids on your campus, or as making certain that every single student on your campus has access to whatever time and whatever support they need to be successful.
We have a system of schooling in America that for about 125 years was based on opportunity to learn. We had jobs for kids that didn't do so well in school, and some of those were pretty decent jobs, and most of those jobs don't exist in the United States of America anymore. The basic fundamental premise is that all students can learn at high levels, and that's what we're going to need as a nation if we're going to continue to prosper and lead.
Every journey doesn't start with a first step. It starts with pointing yourself in the right direction.
So those are all the wrong questions. You know, the how do we raise test scores? How do we implement? How do we stay legal? How do we get better parents? What's the right first question? What do we want for our children? What do our kids need?
What is it the kids need to learn? How do we know if they're learning? And then how do we respond?
If you let a child get that far behind to qualify for traditional special ed, research tells us that by that point, the kids are too far behind to get caught up. If the medical field worked the way most schools have traditionally worked, you wouldn't get help for an illness until you were terminal. Well, at that point, it's not help, it's hospice.
RTI says, what do you need, child? And who on our staff is best trained to provide that?
The only way to really implement RTI in schools is through the professional learning communities model. There's a focus on learning. We develop a collaborative culture, and we use results to drive everything that we do in a PLC.
Before RTI, I would assist my struggling students all by myself with the time that I was allotted and just do the best I could with what I knew. Now I assist my struggling students with the help of my team. We share all of them. We really don't consider them just our own students.
We look at each other and we ask ourselves why we didn't do this before. And you reach a certain point where you don't go back. And it just becomes your culture, the way you do things.
A systematic intervention program, then, is built up of two parts: effective interventions and a systematic way to apply them.
When we talk about a systematic response, there are 5 major areas: identify, determine, monitor, revise, and extend.
We know the characteristics of what makes an effective intervention. The urgency, timely, directed, targeted. The bottom of the pyramid is fat. Why is it fat? That represents what all kids get in your school. That's your initial teaching. But no matter how well you teach it the first time, some kids won't get it. And so we got to be prepared. Our first level of interventions we call Tier 2, or supplemental help. Some kids walk into your school educationally hemorrhaging. They are so far behind, they don't need a little help. They need a lot of help. And that's Tier 3 of this pyramid shape. That is intensive help.
We have a system in place. It's not accidental. It's not reactive. It's proactive.
You can take things that are not working so well on your campus right now, make them ultimately more effective, and probably not cost your school any more money or any more resources. And instead, just do what we're doing now better.
So I want to talk just a minute to a little bit around how MTSS system has developed in Shelby County over the years. So we know that about, 7, 8 years ago, we were on actually probably less than that, maybe 6 years ago, we were on a CAP, a corrective action plan from the Kentucky Department of Education because of our response to intervention practices. And so this is not something that was just unique to Shelby County. This was actually happening in a large majority of counties and states across the country. And so what the struggle was is when the federal mandate of response to intervention started, it really was around making sure that you had interventions, progress monitoring, discussions around students and their progress before they went into special ed. Before that happened, what a majority of students would, if they were failing in their classrooms, they weren't really responding very well to classroom instruction, then there was an automatic assumption that there must be something wrong with the student. And so they were referred for special education services. So what we found ourselves, or the situation we found ourselves in a lot of other places too, not just Shelby County, was that we had a large population of special education students, which a lot of them really didn't need special ed services. They needed some intervention supports to catch up, and then they were okay to move along. But we had a really large population of special education students that necessarily didn't need it. And so when we were put on a corrective action plan, Emily Swindler started really looking at what were the requirements according to the law and started really building a district-wide system for response to intervention. And as she built that system, she started supporting each school and principals and assistant principals and how do you get the system up and going. And so there was a grant to support that work. And so Nancy and I were able to get hired on as your response intervention consultants. Both of us have had some experience around core instruction, special education instruction, behavioral supports, and so we wanted to apply some of our learning to support schools and how to get a system really built up in their building that was going to help kids grow before they need it to be in special education. And so every year, what we've tried to do is make sure that our practices are aligned to what some of the requirements are to the law, but also what practices really have the biggest impact for kids. And so every year we've been working to try and get rid of the things that aren't required to make our time be more focused in on instruction. And so over the last couple of years, we've made some revisions to the Tier 2 structures. We've simplified them a little bit. The forms have been simplified. And then this year, we're really looking at how do we leverage professional learning communities instead of all one-on-one teacher meetings. So we're going to be able to leverage everyone's strengths instead of just us telling everybody, here, try this, here, try that, but it's really leveraging the strengths that you already have on your team. So I kind of wanted to give you a little bit of a history there. So when we start talking about the Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, it might be able to put things a little bit more in perspective for you. So this is a metaphor of a multi-tiered system of support with education and with the healthcare system. And so, tier one, when we think about the healthcare system, we're thinking about a universal prevention. And so that's things that actually we've gotten really good at lately during this pandemic. We know to wear our masks, we know to use hand sanitizer, to wash our hands, to have social distancing, we take our vitamins, we cover our mouth when we cough. All of that is in an effort to prevent getting sick. Well, in education, tier one is also universal prevention. So we are leveraging all the best practices in instruction that we know. We're leveraging our curriculum that we know is based in research. We're instructing all students on grade level standards at rigorous levels. That's our core, all of our core instruction. No matter how well we teach, no matter how well we use best practices, there are going to be students, there are going to be a small number of students that still are not successful at the grade level standards. And so when we experience that, the next step is to layer on a tier two support. So we don't stop tier one, just like the healthcare system doesn't stop washing hands or giving vaccinations. They layer on their tier two supplemental support onto the tier one. So the healthcare system, when you think of tier two supplemental support, you're talking about things like maybe antibiotics or allergy medication to kind of help either get rid of a simplified illness or to help help to treat the symptoms of a small illness. And so there's supplemental supports that are put in place. Educationally, it's the same. So when a student is not reaching mastery or performing well on grade level standards, a supplemental support is usually through small groups. The work that we do within those small groups are dependent on what we're noticing from student work. What is it that they're struggling with? Why do we think they're struggling with it? And what are we going to do for this small group to help them get there? We don't remove them from core instruction. We layer on an extra support for them. Sometimes that is very impactful, and that's all we need to do is we just keep a student in tier two supports and we provide them with a little bit of supplemental intervention. However, there are circumstances, just like in the health field, sometimes in healthcare, no matter how good you are with tier one, no matter how great your supplemental supports are, there are going to be some people that get sick. There will be people that have things such as cancer. And so when we have those more intensive health concerns like cancer, it needs a very specific and targeted plan. A doctor doesn't just say, oh, you have cancer, I'm going to give you this chemo, this radiation, and you're going to be fine. They really look at what kind of cancer do you have, where is your cancer, how far is your cancer spread, what's going to be the best medication, the best treatment plan available for you specifically. It's the same, it's similar with the way that we approach our tier 3 intensive intervention supports. So what the tier 3 interventionists do is they look at student work, they look at progress over time from tier 2. We look at what are some of your diagnostic reports, what is it exactly that's breaking down, and what is our areas of concern beyond just are we worried about reading, what part of reading are we worried about? Are we worried about basic foundational pieces of reading? Are we worried about reading fluency? Are we worried about reading comprehension? Or are we worried about all three of those? So whatever our concerns are, our intervention plan is going to be specifically directed towards what the areas of misconceptions or struggles might be. And so we're not removing tier 1 supports. We're not replacing tier 3 with tier 2. It's layered on. So the student would get very intensive support at this point. They're getting their core instruction. They're getting small group instruction within their classroom a couple times a week with their regular teacher. And then they're also getting almost daily targeted intervention instruction along with those things. So at this point, the student is getting a massive amount of targeted support, so we should expect to see a lot of growth. At this point, if we don't see a lot of growth, that's when your response intervention contact and either your consultant or your coordinator will talk about what is our next step in this? What do we need to do? Do we need to look at a special education evaluation? Do we need to change our interventions and adjust them a little bit? What is it that we need to do for our next steps? So again, tier 1 is really, that's the core for everything that you do around best practices to teach reading, writing, math, and then also behavior. So for core, you're thinking about how do you leverage your Shelby County Public Schools curriculum? What kinds of instructional practices do you use? How are you leveraging the structures in your own classroom? How are you differentiating to meet the needs of your students? Behavior core is your PBIS system, your Positive Behavior Intervention Support System. So through that system, you are instructing on school-wide expectations, you're practicing school-wide expectations, you're giving feedback on school-wide expectations, and you're acknowledging expectations that are met. You're also doing that for your classroom expectations. Also a part of your behavior core is your social emotional learning. Different schools are using different social emotional learning curriculum, but every school should be leveraging some form of social emotional learning this year, which is fairly new this year. I think some schools were doing it a little bit in the past, but this year every school is leveraging social emotional learning to support the development of students, thinking about things like their empathy and their self-awareness and how what they do impacts others. And so that's instruction that you're providing around those pieces of development. So that's your core. If we have a really strong core with our PBIS, our social emotional learning, our core instructional systems, then we should have a smaller number of students that are in intervention. And we see that when we have a really strong, all of those pieces of core are strong, we see a smaller number of students in intervention. That doesn't mean that you will never have students in intervention, but you're really reducing the number of students that need it. So tier 2, let me talk for just a second about what your impacts are. Something that is important for you to recognize is students come in to us with all kinds of things going on in their lives. We cannot control what students come into our building with. We can control what our reactions are. We can control what our teacher behaviors are. The more that we utilize high effect size strategies and structures that we know support student development, the higher outcomes, the better outcomes we're going to create for students. And so some of these teacher behaviors that are important for you to be leveraging consistently are listed below, but I'm going to give you a little bit of information around it. So we already talked about your curriculum. Make sure you're leveraging the Shelby County Public Schools curriculum. It's based in research. It's revised constantly to make sure it's the best that it can be. Make sure you're leveraging that. Modeling. Make sure whatever it is that you want your students to be able to do, that you are giving them direct instruction in it, and that you are modeling what it is that students need. There are a lot of strategies out there that are essential to increase engagement, like discovery learning. It's very important. I don't want for you to think because modeling and direct instruction is also important, that modeling and direct instruction have to be a part of every single lesson you teach. Sometimes your work is going to be around discovery learning. You're increasing their ability to problem solve, to observe, to notice things around them, which also increases their engagement. The more engaged students are, the less academic concerns that we tend to have, the more motivated they are to learn, but it also decreases problem behaviors. Another really impactful strategy or structure that we use is through our goals for students. In core, that looks like your learning targets, where students know exactly what their target is for that lesson and what is their success criteria. For interventions, students should also know what their goals are. They should know what their strategies are to help them reach that goal, and they should know how they're doing in relation to that goal. Whenever we do a progress monitoring probe, we should talk to the students about their progress. They should know where they are in relation to their goal. And then, yes, this one here, high rates of positive to negative feedback. That's really important when you're thinking about academics is important too, but really when we're thinking about behaviors, you get what you focus on. So if we make sure that we are providing positive either feedback or positive interactions with students, that's going to increase the positive reactions that we get from them. I'm not saying that you never correct a behavior, but we always want to be mindful of letting kids know that they belong, that you care for them, they deserve to be there, and they do have some good qualities. And so positive interactions can be things like a pat on the back. I know touching right now is kind of a no-no, but making eye contact, smiling, giving them a thumbs up. Those are all positive interactions that doesn't necessarily have to be a verbal praise. Make sure that you're using at least 4-to-1 positive interactions to every corrective piece of feedback that you're providing. So tier 2, you're doing all these amazing things in core, but you still have some kids that are struggling either with academics or behavior. You can probably expect around 15% of your student population, maybe up to 20, that's going to need tier 2 supports. Now, just because a student needs intervention, that doesn't mean every single kid that you have in a small group in your classroom needs to be brought to the official MTSS process. We want to make sure, we're going to talk about student selection here in a few moments, but you're going to have a lot of students that are going to need some tier 2 support. Like if you think of 20% of your classroom, that's like a small group of students, maybe 4 or 5 kids per classroom that's going to need some, small group instruction. Different schools have different structures. So again, that's dependent on what your principal decides upon. But you can expect to have that many kids that you're going to need to do some tier 2 supports. And so again, that's core, plus you're adding a supplemental intervention. When a student is in MTSS structure, they are progress monitored by the regular classroom teacher every 2 weeks, typically. Sometimes there's some changes to that, like behavior is usually more often than that. But typically, you're going to see academic progress monitoring every 2 weeks. Again, tier 2 is usually done through small groups of students unless there's a big disparity between where one of your students you're concerned with compared to some of your other students. So most of the time it's in small group instruction. Usually as you move up in tiers, you're also increasing in your explicit instruction. And at tier 2, you can either focus in on a particular standard that you're going to be able to continue for an extended period of time, or it can be a skills gap that you're filling in. Your groupings should be fluid, but we want to make sure that if we select students that are in the MTSS process where we're really talking about their progress monitoring consistently and what their responses are, you want to make sure that you don't release the student until, as a team, we've come together and we've decided, yes, this is probably a good time. We can start fading some intervention. But again, those are fluid. We can add and remove students from tier 2. Also, we leverage our universal screeners and our diagnostic assessments to make sure that we select the right students that need to be in this system, but also to see, on a generalized scale, how is their progress. Diagnostics also help us pinpoint where the breakdown in learning has occurred. So we're able to really build a plan that is individualized to that student. That's the reason you don't want to just start school and throw a kid in intervention. You want to make sure that you have some universal screening data to be able to build a plan that really is going to be meeting that student's needs. Like I said earlier, kids should know what their goals are, they should know what their strategies are, and they should know what their progress is towards that goal. Tier 3 is where we move into that really intensive targeted intervention. This is usually done by an outside interventionist. I know this year is during the pandemic is a little changed because a lot of our interventionists has gone back to the classroom. So our structures or our systems in our schools are going to look a little bit different. But typically, when you get to tier 3 instruction, it is much more frequent. Its duration is usually a little bit longer, and your targeted instruction is really ultra focused. So it might not be around an entire standard. It might be around very specific skill deficits. Again, this is where your explicit instruction and your guided practice and your gradual release of responsibility is really important. You don't want to always keep students in explicit instruction, but when you get to tier 3, you want to make sure you're starting there. This is also where interventions and progress monitoring is broken up into very specific areas of concern. Like I mentioned earlier, if you're worried about reading, the tier 3 interventionist has to figure out what part of reading are we worried about. Is it basic reading, reading fluency, reading comprehension? where are those gaps? If it's every one of those areas, which it very well can be, we want to make sure that we're intervening specifically for those areas and monitoring progress. Usually in Tier 3, you have progress monitoring every week on each goal. And then also Nancy and I, part of our responsibility is to make sure that the interventions that we're suggesting and recommending is evidence-based, that there is research and evidence to prove that these are impactful interventions. It's not just something we come up with. And again, students should be made aware of their goal, what their strategies are, and how they're progressing towards meeting that goal. Possible criteria. This is just a guideline. Every student, we think about them from different perspectives. So if they don't fall into these criteria, remember, this is just a guideline. Typically, we think about students that are consistently in the intervention group through data teams. A lot of the times we'll talk about them in MTSS. Also, if we're thinking about students that are consistently scoring below the 20th percentile in MAP. And then also we also think about our bottom 10% on achievement. So when we're looking at MAP, maybe it's not every single kid that's below the 20th percentile. That's a large number of students in some schools. We might be thinking about what is the 10% of students that are having the most difficulty achieving. And so we might look at those students as well. We also combine diagnostic results with MAP. MAP is our universal screener that we just look at the beginning, but we also pull in other pieces of evidence to help us make sure we're selecting the right kids. And then also for Tier 3, we start looking at maybe a little bit more intensive need. So we're probably focused in on kids that are consistently in the intervention groups and data teams. We're seeing that they're consistently scoring below the 10th percentile. Here it says the 1st through the 20th. That's wiggle room, but a lot of the times when we have large numbers of students in MTSS, we really need to focus our Tier 3 support, our Tier 3 supports on students that are scoring below the 10th percentile. Again, that's very dependent on a student's needs. It could be more. And then we also think about, has the student been in intervention for a long time? If a student has needed Tier 2 or Tier 3 supports to continue the growth that they've been doing up until this point, we may keep them in Tier 3 interventions. Just because a student has been in Tier 3 interventions for a long time doesn't necessarily mean that they need to go to a special ed referral. Sometimes being in Tier 3 interventions is what has created that success. And when we fade it, we might find that their growth isn't quite as rapid. So we might decide, you know what, we're going to keep this child in maybe for a little bit longer to see how we might be able to fade it in a more effective way. So this is an odometer around the work of John Hattie. If you've been in the district for a while, you'll remember John Hattie. If you haven't been in the district for a while, John Hattie is a researcher who does a meta-analysis of close to 1 million research studies around educational strategies and structures. And so what his goal is to look at, of all the things that we do in education, what are the most impactful in creating high rates of student progress. And so this is an odometer of that. So if you look at the middle line here, 4/10, this is the line that indicates 1 year's growth. If a kid just comes into school, they're in a typical classroom and they're there, this is typically 1 year of growth. What we want to do through leveraging the high effect size strategies, both in core, but also thinking about our different structures within our school system, is we want to think about what are those things that create more than 1 year of growth. So anything in the blue, anything that shows up in the blue means that it has the potential to create more than 1 year's growth for students. It's called the zone of desired effect. So this is a chart of not necessarily just intervention strategies, but more of structures and systems and pieces of how we do things that really impact students. And so when we look at the zone of desired effect here, we notice things like response to intervention. That is a highly effective structure and system that is utilized in the education field. It has a 1.29 effect size, which means it has the potential to grow students up to 3 years in 1 year's time. That's pretty huge. That doesn't mean that every single kid that's ever in MTSS is guaranteed to grow 3 years in 1 year, but it has the potential to do that if we're really intentional with the way that we're leveraging it. So why? Why does that have such a high effect size? Well, if you think about what response intervention is and what are the components of it, it's multiple high effect size strategies combined into one. First of all, you're selecting students before they get into a spot where they're so far they're having such a struggle. You're trying to be proactive about that. So we're selecting students based off of data. We are using multiple data points to figure out where's the student struggling. We select an intervention plan that is personalized to that student. We progress and monitor it. We're using it's formative assessment, right? We're leveraging formative assessment to see what is their response to the intervention that we're providing. We're making next step decisions off of student work analysis. And then we're also leveraging a collaborative team to help us make decisions that's going to impact the student. And we're constantly coming back to it. Those are multiple high effect size strategies that are deployed for one system. Another really high effect size is the Piaget program. When you think of Piaget programs, you're thinking about things that develop metacognitive strategies. So something that we leverage in Shelby County is our thinking strategies and our workshop model. The whole point of that is to help students recognize themselves as learners, become metacognitive, recognizing how they think, how they process, what are some strategies to help them when they get stuck. That has a really high effect size of 1.28, almost as high as response to intervention. And then also a really important, really the most impactful, it's not really a strategy really or a structure, but it's really a mindset. The most impactful mindset is a 1.6. It's collective teacher efficacy. And what this means is, do the teachers recognize that they make a difference in the lives of these students? Do they know there is some struggles that my students are here with? I know that I can intervene. I know that I can do something about it. I know that I can support this child to help them leave me in a better place than when they came to me. It's a level of confidence. It's a level of recognizing if I don't know something, which is totally fine, I know where I can go to get it. If I don't have a resource, I know that I can get my hands on a resource to support the student. If I have a hard time figuring out the student, I know that I have a support team that's going to help me figure things out. It's really about a teacher mindset of recognizing their impact on students. Teachers have massive amounts of impact on the lives of students. When you see that in yourself and you realize how important you really are to the lives of kids, that's where you're going to have the biggest impact on kids. Don't forget your value. This is a final little video that does a synthesis of all that I've been talking about in probably a much more linear and structured way. So this is Susan Robertson from Kentucky Avery, who gives a really shortened, synthesized explanation of MTSS.
Multi-tiered systems of support, or MTSS, is a framework for selecting, implementing, and evaluating effective academic and behavior support systems for all students. It is designed first and foremost to prevent students from needing intensive intervention by ensuring high-quality, evidence-based instructional practices are implemented as part of the core curriculum. And for students who still need additional support, MTSS enables early identification of students who may be struggling academically or behaviorally to provide them with targeted support. The MTSS framework involves 4 key components: prediction, prevention, consistency, and evaluation. We use universal screeners to predict where our students may fail. We develop supports to prevent these failures. We work together to consistently implement these strategies. And we analyze data to monitor progress and identify areas or students that need more intensive and individualized support. Put simply, MTSS is a system for ensuring effective instruction is being delivered for both academics and behavior across all levels of intervention. MTSS is the umbrella term that integrates two commonly used approaches: academic response to intervention, or RTI, and school-wide positive behavior interventions and supports, or PBIS. MTSS seeks to combine these two successful approaches by integrating existing academic and behavior support systems into this seamless whole. It makes sense to combine these two systems because academic issues and problem behaviors are not mutually exclusive. Education research consistently demonstrates a strong relationship between the two. For example, an MTSS system benefits students who have both academic and behavioral challenges by simultaneously reviewing both sets of data. An integrated system means that educators will be working together to support students rather than considering only one source of information. When applying this logic to schools, Tier 1 supports are universal in nature, meaning that all students receive these supports. In fact, 80% of our students should be successful with Tier 1 supports. These supports include all students receiving high-quality instruction in the core curriculum that is clearly aligned to the curriculum standards, as well as universal school-wide research-based positive behavior supports. Tier 1 supports are very important, and they provide the foundation on which all supplementary interventions are developed. They are also the most cost-effective means of addressing learners' needs. As such, Tier 1 supports need to be evidence-based, allow for differentiation, and include progress monitoring. If universal screening and progress monitoring data indicate that a student is not successful with Tier 1 instruction, then additional evidence-based intervention is warranted. Tier 2 supports are provided in addition to the Tier 1 core instruction and target the individual student's specific area of need. In a tiered support model, these interventions are provided to approximately 15% of the student population, ideally in a small group setting. If the data shows a student is not making adequate progress in Tier 2, then individualized supports are needed. These evidence-based interventions are intended to serve approximately 5% of students. Tier 3 interventions are very resource intensive and therefore should only be used for a small number of students. Every effort should be made to prevent students from needing Tier 3 supports. A major benefit of MTSS includes its emphasis on addressing the needs of all learners. All students receive evidence-based, rigorous academic and behavioral instruction, ruling out inadequate teaching. MTSS is proactive rather than reactive. Students no longer need to wait to fail to receive the supports they need to be successful. MTSS is not another program. It is a multi-tier process for identifying and addressing your students' academic and behavioral needs before they become problematic. MTSS is founded on the premise that the best intervention is prevention.
So, recognizing that you are a very important piece to this puzzle of MTSS and student intervention and progress, what is the most important thing that you want to be mindful of in yourself as we prepare to get the system going or as we go through the system this school year? What do you need to be mindful of in yourself? Thank you for your time. If you have any questions, concerns, things that you want to talk about, you can send an email to Nancy Page or me, Jamie Mazine, or your RTI school contact. Most of the places it's your assistant principal, but there are other places where it might be an interventionist or a counselor. So follow up, and if you have any questions, any concerns, let us know. Your RTI contact will be reaching out to you soon to let you know what your schedules are, so we can start looking at student data and making plans for kids. Thank you, and have a great day.